I don't think there are enough words in the English language, or there are enough appropriate words to describe the range of emotions that I think Pennsylvanians share with their neighbors in Virginia, New York, and the rest of America after literally witnessing the most brutal act of terrorism, perhaps in mankind, at least in recent history.
This is CNN.
The day after a massive and unprecedented terrorist attack on America, a nation mourns.
A major recovery effort is underway in Lower Manhattan right now, a search for thousands of innocent victims and hundreds of their rescuers who were lost in the destruction.
And good morning, I'm Vince Cellini along with Carol Lynn. And Lower Manhattan this morning lying in a mountain of rubble, fewer than 24 hours after the world's worst ever terrorist attack.
That's right, Vince. Efforts are underway at this hour right now to find what is feared to be thousands of victims. Now, here are some of the latest pictures, and as you can see, heavy equipment is now on the scene for helping.
Among the victims, more than 300 firefighters are missing, feared dead. They were among the first crews to enter the World Trade Center area after the initial plane crashes.
We also have new pictures of those terrible moments when two passenger jets became missiles aimed at the Twin Towers.
Oh, shit!
More than 20 hours later, it is still seemingly unbelievable that this even happened. CNN's Garrick Utley is live in New York for the latest on the rescue operation. Garrick, do we yet know how many people survived, how many people died?
We can't even begin to speculate on that, Carol. The mayor, other government officials have said they've not even tried to guess, although the figure will obviously be in the thousands. It's now just after 5 a.m. as you well know, here on the East Coast of the United States, here in New York City. And this is the time that this metropolis usually starts to come to work, get up and get at it in the New York way, but not this morning. Nobody's really coming into town. The streets, even at this hour, are still empty. The only sounds we hear is the occasional siren of an ambulance or a police car racing around Manhattan Island. The rescue work, as we saw just a moment ago, is continuing. It has been going on all night down at the World Trade Center site. The generators or the floodlights were brought in. The fire department is still there. Rescue workers are starting to move the rubble, the giant earth-moving machine. But of course, this is going to go on for days and days. And what is really hard for many, I think, of us to understand or comprehend, that what seems to have been a trauma that has gone on for an eternity has really been with us for, 20 hours now. And it started under such different circumstances.
It was such a beautiful morning. The air was clear over Manhattan, the sky a rich blue. The two twin towers stood tall, anchored in bedrock of granite, so secure, so unshakable. And then, we have seen smoke and destruction before, but we've never seen madness like this, or catastrophe like this. It was a morning when words could only begin to express the horror.
It was like a blizzard, but a blizzard that wasn't cold, a blizzard that had no wind. It was just hot.
There was an enormous fireball. There was fire debris falling to the ground, and then just a whole kind of mushroom of smoke that sort of just billowed up.
We knew that some of what happened this morning could happen, that there could be another attack on the World Trade Center as there was 8 years ago, that terrorists might attack the Pentagon and hijack commercial flights. But how could we imagine that all this could happen? That much of the government would be shut down, the capital of the United States evacuated, and the White House, that the president of the most powerful nation in the world would take evasive action for his own security. Across this nation, from airports closed down to home to workplace, we watched and tried to comprehend what we were seeing. It took time after the shock of the terror to digest the dimension of the human tragedy. We tried to imagine what those caught in the soaring towers, in the doomed planes in the Pentagon went through. Before the end, we can only wonder what happens next. The president vows action.
The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice.
Retaliation, even revenge, may feel sweet one day, but right now there are only the remnants of terror, the pain of the tragedy, and the tears.
And now there is the morning after and the days to come, and the morning newspaper, another one, has reached Manhattan Island, New York's Daily News, the largest circulating tabloid in the United States, the oldest one too. The headline is simply, "It's War," in red letters, pictures throughout the newspaper as throughout the other journals coming out of this city and across the country this day. Really telling us nothing new, except that it's war. The question, of course, Carol, is if we know where the battleground is. It was right down here in lower Manhattan. It was in the Pentagon today or yesterday. The search there continues. The question is, where is the enemy? And that's what we will be asking for days and weeks to come.
Certainly.
Carol?
And how do we find the enemy? Thank you very much, Garrick Utley, reporting from New York. We will get to that matter in just a moment, but right now we want to talk about the recovery operation. New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani says hospitals have so far treated 1,100 people. Catholic Cardinal Edward Egan arrived at St. Vincent's Hospital to administer last rites to a dozen victims. CNN's Michael Oku is monitoring the situation at St. Vincent's, and he joins us now live. Michael.
Carol, in a couple hours, most New Yorkers will awaken a city with a gaping hole in its skyline. But there is absolutely no lack of compassion or empathy in many of the people at this scene on this night. Walking along, I should say that many of the pedestrians here at St. Vincent's Hospital, which of course has become the main triage center here in New York, have greeted each other with knowing nods, which, as you can imagine, is not common practice here in New York. It's been a very strangely silent night. Just north of here, a couple blocks on 14th Street, the police department has set up barricades, and that's limiting the traffic just south of 14th Street to residents, police vehicles, and occasionally emergency medical vehicles whose sirens occasionally punctuate and break the eerie silence. Now, about 40 minutes ago, we saw 3 victims. And in fact, in the last 1 minute, we saw a 4th victim who we identified as a police officer. They were rushed into the hospital, but it is unclear whether any of those victims sustained injuries associated with the World Trade Center attack. Hospital officials here at St. Vincent's said that they have admitted 327 patients associated with the attack, 50 to 55 of whom were in critical condition as of 10:30 last night, Eastern Time. Many of those victims sustained severe burns, many of those burns to the face. Officials say that they will have another briefing at about 6:30 this morning, and we will be here, of course, live for that. Back to you, Carol.
All right, thank you very much. Michael Oku, outside of St. Vincent's Hospital this morning. It could be weeks before we know the absolute total number of people who were injured and killed. And of course, the hunt for suspects does go on. Last night, President Bush, in an Oval Office address, promised to hunt down those responsible, denounced this failed attempt, as he called it, to scare the United States. But what are the administration's options? Former State Department spokesman and former Assistant Secretary to the State Department, James Rubin, joins us now from our London bureau. Good morning, Jamie.
Good morning to you.
Well, certainly Americans will be waking up this morning asking, how could this possibly happen? And we have learned that just last month, security officials had warned about Osama bin Laden's threat to American installations overseas. Just last Friday, the State Department issued travel warnings to Americans. So how is it that the American intelligence community failed to detect that something like this could happen?
Well, I suspect that is the $64,000 question that's going to be examined day after day by the committees of Congress, by the intelligence community itself, and by the administration. Clearly, what we've seen is an attack not just on the United States, but on the nerve center of the civilized world, which is what the World Trade Center is. And I think in terms of the administration's options that you mentioned earlier, I think first and foremost, they're going to have to nail down if this really was Osama bin Laden. It certainly has all the fingerprints of an Osama bin Laden or his followers' attack. It follows closely on ideas that were discussed in previous attacks, namely to take over jetliners and crash them into American facilities. It follows on their attempt to destroy the World Trade Center before. So it has all the fingerprints of Osama bin Laden. I think the important point that President Bush stressed last night is that we are not going to allow governments to come up with ridiculous arguments, such as the Afghanistan government, that somehow Osama bin Laden, who's masterminding these attacks, is a guest of their country and therefore can't be turned over. We're now at war. The lower part of Manhattan is a war zone. The United States has never been attacked like this before. It looks, unfortunately, like it may be on the scale of Pearl Harbor in terms of the deaths of Americans by surprise. And Americans are going to respond to that war. And the key question is whether the President of the United States is going to be able to gather the civilized countries of the world, all of them, one by one, putting the question to them, are you on the side of the civilized peoples, the peoples who believe in not just freedom but in safety and security, or are you going to be on the side of these evil terrorists? And that diplomatic campaign has already begun, and it's going to be an enormous challenge because there's no way to combat this kind of terrorism and prevent it from happening again without the support of large numbers of countries in the world.
Which raises another question, Jamie. How far should the United States go in going after sympathetic governments who might be supporting Osama bin Laden? Of course, you know that it's thought that he's being harbored by the Taliban in Afghanistan. So even with a united front, what options do the administration have in going after the Taliban?
Well, I don't think there's any question that the Taliban are harboring Osama bin Laden. They've been doing so for some years now. I don't think there's any question that there are other individuals around the world who have been part and parcel of his fundraising apparatus and who have given aid and comfort to this enemy of the United States. In terms of military options, economic options, diplomatic options, at this point I think it would be premature for me to say, except to say that when people talk about military action, it should not be thought about as retribution. It should be thought about as preemption. This organization has acted before, time after time, against the World Trade Center, against the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, against the USS Cole. If indeed they acted yesterday, as it looks like they did, they are going to act again. And the use of military force is not for some retribution or revenge, if it comes to that. It's to deter and preempt them from acting another time and killing even more people than we've seen in the last 24 hours.
So, Jamie, take us into the process then. Take us into behind the scenes at the National Security Operation and at the State Department. What discussions are being had today? Who is sitting at the table? And what decisions are likely needed to be made in the next 24 to 48 hours?
Well, I think on the domestic side, obviously, the emergency system is going to be put in place to try to help the city of New York and the state of New York deal with its tragedy in Lower Manhattan and obviously the tragedy at the Pentagon and in Pennsylvania. On the foreign policy side, the national security side, I think the first order of business is to determine if there are any other potential capabilities for these terrorists to take over aircraft again, and I think by stopping the flights and changing the security apparatus by which pilots operate will be prime on the agenda. On the diplomatic side, I think what will be happening is that the Secretary of State or his representative now, because I gather he's flying back from Peru, will be asked to canvass the world's governments to try to ascertain the level of support we're getting from all of the key countries. We need a coalition against terrorism, and that coalition has to be more than just our NATO allies who are committed by treaty to defend the United States if it comes under attack, but also countries like Russia and moderate Arab states and other countries, perhaps even the Chinese, to commit with us in this battle against terrorism, so that if the Osama bin Laden organization is proved to be responsible, that those countries support us in whatever measures we need to take, not to act in revenge, but to act to prevent them from doing it again to another civilized country, because this is just the beginning of what they see as a permanent campaign against the United States and the civilized world. So I think all of those steps are being taken. And finally, there is a reassurance that has to take place, and I think President Bush has done a good job so far, but he and his administration need to do an even better job today, tomorrow, and in the weeks to come to reassure not only the American people that all these steps are being taken, but to reassure the financial markets, to make clear that the United States nerve center of commerce in Wall Street may have been attacked, but our nerves are made of steel, and we're going to go forward and continue our daily business in the business of America, because that's what these terrorists are trying to prevent. And he needs to convince every American citizen that they need to get up in the morning and do all the things they used to do, and do them perhaps with more care and more caution, but to not let the terrorists win by changing our freedoms or changing our habits.
James Rubin, former State Department spokesman from London. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Washington, D.C. was in the crosshairs of terrorism. Senior White House correspondent John King and national correspondent Bob Franken on the scene for us this morning in the nation's capital. First, let's go to John King. John.
Well, Vince, in the hours ahead, look for the administration to move aggressively on several fronts. First, an effort by the White House to make the case the federal government is doing all it can for the rescue and the relief operation. As part of that, there will even be a symbolic blood drive on the White House grounds this morning. Also, Secretary of State Colin Powell will be out making the round of morning news shows, also delivering remarks here in Washington, promising a thorough investigation and promising, as Jamie Rubin was just speaking about, to reach out to governments around the world to build a new coalition against international terrorism. Now, the president will awake this morning and be briefed once again by his national security team. He will also have a bipartisan meeting with the congressional leadership at the White House and deliver some public remarks after that statement. That, an effort by the White House to show continuity and resolve that the government is at work, even as the investigation and the rescue and relief efforts unfold. Now, Mr. Bush last night delivered a nationally televised address to the nation, certainly a defining moment for this president on a defining day for the country. Mr. Bush, speaking to the American people from the Oval Office, said the nation was gripped by what he called a quiet, unyielding anger.
The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation.
Now, Mr. Bush also said as the investigation continues, the United States would make, quote, no distinction between the terrorists and those who harbor them. The administration publicly saying the investigation continues privately, though, we are told, at a national security briefing at the White House last night, as well as in private briefings to key members of Congress. Senior administration officials are saying that they are confident the evidence collected so far points to the suspected Saudi terrorist Osama bin Laden and associates and organizations affiliated with him. The administration promising to take retaliation when its investigation is completed. One official I spoke to last night after this meeting said they were going to take their time. This official saying they wanted to make sure they sorted this out before acting. Again, look for more words from the president later this morning after he receives an update on the latest on the investigation, as well as the relief and rescue operations underway at the Pentagon and in New York City. Vince?
Well, John, in reading some of the information you've transmitted to us overnight, United Flight 93, which crashed in Pennsylvania, may have had a more specific target. I wonder if you can elaborate on that.
Still some speculation involved in this, but we are told that law enforcement officials and other administration officials in their briefings to key members of Congress said that based on the information they have so far, they believe that that plane was turning south, heading toward Washington. 3 possible targets. 1, the presidential retreat of Camp David outside of Washington in Maryland. More likely, though, according to our sources, the White House or the U.S. Capitol. They believe that plane was ultimately headed for Washington. No explanation yet as to why it crashed in Pennsylvania, but that is what we are told. Key members of Congress are being told as the investigation unfolds. At least so far, they believe that the target for that plane was here in Washington. Vince?
White House senior correspondent John King, thank you very much. We'll be checking in with you throughout these early morning hours and into daylight on Wednesday. Well, the Pentagon is the nation's military nerve center and an important symbol of U.S. strength. On Tuesday, September 11, 2001, it was a target. Officials now say as many as 800 employees died in the attack on the Pentagon. CNN national correspondent Bob Franken is here with the latest. Bob?
Well, this morning, when regular business hours occur, there's going to be an attempt at a small victory. That is to say that the Defense Secretary has ordered that parts of the building that can be open for business will be open for business. That is a small victory over the big loss of yesterday when a plane crashed into it. You can see it in the back of me. We're going to find out, or start to find out as the day unfolds, just how significant, how big that loss is. Once daybreak occurs, officials are going to check to see if the fire has receded enough that they can go into the building, start combing through the rubble, and finding out in human terms just how many casualties there were. That, of course, is going to be an extended process. The Pentagon has just steadfastly refused to give away any information about the number of people who they expect might have been killed. They're talking about figures that might go into the hundreds, although the Pentagon says that some estimates that have gone as high as 800 may be far too high, but they're going to find the grim task of doing that. They're going to start that this morning. Business is still going on at the Pentagon. There is still military planning going on. There are some efforts, in fact, to make sure that the United States remains protected on both coasts. Flotillas of military ships, including aircraft carriers, have been sent to sea on both the east and west coast and along the coast of Hawaii to protect against any contingency. Nothing is expected in particular, but of course, this tragic day was not expected yesterday. Vince?
Bob, before we let you go, President Bush talked about how important it was to have business go on as usual. You touched on this. And how important is it to show some semblance of order, things taking place as they should at the Pentagon?
Well, it's going to be difficult to do that. It's quite interesting. Only about half of this building is really considered safe enough to conduct business, although, of course, it was not half that was really wiped out by the airplane that crashed into it. You can see in back of me there were 3 of the corridors that were hit. There is actually 17 miles of corridors in the Pentagon, and about half of that is going to be considered structurally unsafe, at least not proven to be safe, but that other half is going to be open for business. That is the half that will include so many of the vital functions here, the Military Command Center, the offices of the top-ranking people, the secretaries and deputy secretaries. Business will be going on there, and of course, it's business in time of crisis.
Thank you very much. CNN national correspondent Bob Franken.
Well, Vince, amid the chaos in New York and Washington, there was another hijacking and plane crash, and this time it was in Pennsylvania. United Airlines Flight 93 crashed in a field near Pittsburgh. There were 45 people on board, and no one survived.
What we're doing is maintaining the scene. We have 150 troopers, both mounted on horseback and on foot, in 2 separate perimeters, keeping the scene as pristine as possible. Protect it for the further investigation and to make sure that no one is injured through a biohazard or wants to get into the crime scene.
And just a few minutes ago, John King reported that government sources are telling CNN United Flight 93 was likely headed for a government target, possibly the White House, the Capitol, or even Camp David.
Well, so many people have outpourings of emotion. We'd like to hear from you, and to do that, you can contact us by email at this address, daybreak@cnn.com. Please include your name and where you are writing from, and this might be an opportunity for you to express your views on this terrible, terrible turn of events.
Also, as a service to our viewers, Vince, some of you might want to grab a pen or pencil throughout the day. We're going to be broadcasting telephone numbers where you can call for information about passengers, flights, that sort of thing. So these numbers will run throughout the morning, so go ahead and prepare for that if you need to. Also, a handful of people who died in the plane crashes had one last chance to say goodbye to their loved ones. In fact, one man called his family in San Francisco from United Flight 93.
That I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again.
I said that.
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother.
I got on the phone, Mark, and he said, hi, Mom, this is Mark Bingham. Giving me his last name. And he said, I want to let you know that I love you. And I'm flying, I think he said I'm in the air. I'm calling you on the air phone of the airplane.
In his seat?
I presume so. He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And I said, well, who are they, Mark? And he repeated that he loved me, and he said, I don't think he said, I don't know who they are. He became distracted there, as if someone was speaking to him, and he said it's something to the effect of, it's true, and then the phone went dead.
Her son, Mark Bingham, was on the flight that crashed in that field near Pittsburgh. Now, John Ogonowski was the captain of American Airlines Flight 11, and his plane crashed into one of the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center. His family spoke out yesterday.
I ask all of you for your prayers for, as I refer to him, as Brother John. And I ask you to also pray for our whole country today in this tragedy that's impacting our whole country.
Mr. Ogonowski leaves a wife and 3 daughters. Vince?
4 planes hijacked and brought down in one day. It has many questioning the safety of the sky. Paul Baum is the editor of Aviation Security International, a former security chief at TWA, and he joins us from London this morning. Good morning, Mr. Baum.
Good morning to you.
Sir, this is the question that many Americans are asking right now. How could this happen? How could 4 commercial airliners be hijacked in the morning? And it's just beyond belief. How did it happen?
Absolutely, it is an absolute tragedy, the real nightmare scenario for the aviation security industry and, of course, for the American people and the world as a whole. The only thing that could have been worse would have been if it had been a chemical or biological attack on one of these cities. It would appear that the real failing has been on the intelligence side in preventing these incidents. In the past, intelligence has worked. You only have to go back to 1995 when American intelligence basically thwarted, in what was known as the Bojinga plot, the blowing up of 12 American airliners on one single day. That day, American intelligence worked. September the 11th, 2001, unfortunately, it all fell apart. And what the pictures that we've all been witnessing are those of really of a war scene. You could have been seeing those pictures of the Balkans or of the Middle East, and yet this was downtown Manhattan, downtown Washington. And that just sort of reminds me of...
Excuse me, Mr. Baum, you talked about the overall picture and intelligence, but what about the basics of airport security? And that is these people commandeering a plane. Would we be shocked at how easily that can be done and how easily it might have been done yesterday?
I'd love to say that I was shocked. Truth is, I wasn't. I was shocked by the outcome and the fact that probably at least 12 people could have decided to go to their deaths in such a tragic manner and killing so many other innocent people in the process. Yes, airport security procedures are going to have to be reviewed, especially domestically in the United States. I don't think it's a surprise that they targeted American Airlines and United Airlines, basically the two giants of the aviation industry. It used to be Pan Am and TWA. It's no surprise that they targeted flights that were going to the West Coast, to San Francisco and Los Angeles, so that on impact, those planes would have been carrying far more fuel than any other aircraft in the sky, so the impact would have been that much greater. But certainly domestic aviation security is going to have to be reviewed. But that said, it's not such an easy thing to do. In Europe, we have a situation where only the passengers can go to the gates. In the United States, as many of your viewers will be well aware, anybody meeting or greeting passengers can go through the security checkpoints and up to the gates, meaning that there's an increased stress on the screeners.
Mr. Baum, maybe as a security expert, you can tell us exactly what pilots and flight attendants are instructed to do in case of an emergency, in case of a hijacking. What are their immediate instructions, or procedurally?
Well, the procedures, unlike mechanical failures, are basically to evaluate the type of hijacker. There are 4 different types of hijackers. There are criminals, there are terrorists, there are asylum seekers, and there are the insane or the mentally disturbed. This may be a combination of different types, but you have to react to the type of hijacker you have. Now, if, as we're led to believe, that these were very violent people who simply got out of their seats and started slashing flight attendants, then there is only so much that one can do, and one would have expected them to have just sort of gone back to their natural survival instincts and done whatever they could possibly do to survive. What I do not believe was the case.
Go ahead, sir. Excuse me. Go ahead.
Sorry, I certainly don't believe that it was the pilots themselves, even at knife point or gunpoint, that would have intentionally flown their aircraft into the Twin Towers or into the Pentagon.
You mentioned this briefly, you touched on this, but what will this mean for the future, security-wise, for commercial airlines? What can you see maybe immediately and through the first few months after this situation?
Well, certainly, I mean, there's already been an increase to threat code Delta in the United States, so security is basically at its highest level of alert once the planes go back in the skies. But that said, so there won't be things like curbside check-in. There will be restricting access to the gate areas. But I think that it's possibly taken an incident like this to prove that domestic security has to be treated the same way as international security on international flights. In other words, that there needs to be positive passenger bag match, that if you check a bag in for a flight, that you travel on that flight, that only passengers go to the gate areas, and certainly that the identification checks that are carried out by the check-in agents are going to be much more stringent. That said, I don't think we need to focus solely on screening of passengers. This was a very well orchestrated attack. This involved insiders, either in the airlines or in the airports. Certainly there are reports coming through this morning from Boston of people with contacts in the UAE with flight manuals were found in a car in Boston. These people knew what they were doing. They probably had very good contacts, and they didn't necessarily go through the passenger screening points.
All right, Philip Baum, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Vince, as dawn begins to break over the East Coast, we take you now live for what for many of you could be the first look here on this day after of this devastating terrorist attack. The gap in the sky where you are looking is where the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center once stood. The New York skyline completely changed this morning as hundreds of firefighters are going through the rubble, trying to find if there are any survivors, trying to count the dead. We may not know for weeks how many people died in this attack on one of America's most significant financial power centers. And then on to Washington now, where we have this devastating scene of the Pentagon. There you see the collapsed area of the building where a passenger jet plowed through to the inner circle of the Pentagon. Once again, rescue operations there underway. As many as 800 or more Pentagon employees may have died in this attack. We are covering this throughout the day, but in the meantime, of course, Garrett Utley on the scene in New York, reviewing the damage, counting the losses. Garrett?
And Carol, also at this moment, we want to take a few moments and think about some of the heroes in today's tragedy, or yesterday's tragedy. Of course, we don't know how many they were and what was happening in that airplane that crashed in Pennsylvania or in the Pentagon offices or even here in Lower Manhattan. But we do know this. We do know that 80 or more members of the New York City Police Department, men and women, are missing and feared lost. We know that 300 or perhaps even more members of the New York City Fire Department are missing or lost. Who were they? They were people doing their jobs. They were the ones this morning or yesterday morning who were racing into those twin towers to save people, going up the stairwells while everybody else was racing out, and they raced into a trap. Here's a report from correspondent Deborah Farrick.
Many of the 300 firefighters missing and feared dead were believed to be inside the World Trade Center when it collapsed.
When I can't find anybody from 5 rescues and 7 squads, and it's just it's a devastating thing. I don't know. Well, the fire department will recover, but I don't know how.
Arriving first on scene, they ran into the burning towers, carrying hoses and trying to get people to safety.
The horror of it all was all the first alarm, second alarm, third alarm, fifth alarm companies. They were all in there. And there's a lot of companies that wiped out, from what I understand.
Fire engines were crushed, a strategic command center silenced, and several of the highest-ranking fire officials buried beneath tons of dust and steel.
I don't know what to say. We lost people that have given over 40 years.
Those who got out in time went back, injuries and all, to search for their friends. Others off duty grabbed their gear and raced to help dig out any possible survivors.
My brother works in the 91st floor. My brother, and he's unaccounted for at this time. So I'm just, doing a lot of praying.
Praying amidst an unnatural silence.
That's probably what amazed me the most. There was no people to be seen. Even the dogs couldn't find people.
At firehouses in Manhattan, there were flowers and mourning as everyone waited, holding out hope.
They should have been here already. The rig is not back. They're not back. They should have been back.
More than 30 police officers also died. Choking back tears, several firefighters summed up the catastrophe.
These are your buddies.
We lost a lot of friends today. A lot of friends.
A loss that will be shared by all New Yorkers. Deborah Farrick, CNN, New York.
And now we have some of the names of the 4 most high-ranking members of the New York City Fire Department. We'd like to mention them to you because we're getting so few names of victims in yesterday's disaster. Peter Gonchi, the Fire Department Chief. William Feehan, First Deputy Commissioner of the Fire Department. Ray Downey, Chief of Special Operations Command. And the Reverend Michael Judge, the New York Fire Department chaplain, missing and feared lost down in Lower Manhattan today. What more can we say? What are New Yorkers waking up to? Well, now they're waking up to their morning newspapers, and now the New York Times is there. That says it all. U.S. attacked, the picture, and the stories of what happened. Today's headline, a headline that will not be forgotten. And back to you now, Carolyn Vince in Atlanta.
Certainly not the pictures that we're seeing and continue to see. Deborah Farrick was reporting on what she called an unnatural silence in this city that never sleeps. What is the scene below you? What is the city like compared to how it would normally be at this very early morning hour?
Well, at this morning hour, it'd be pretty busy. 5:40, the workers will be pouring into town already, even before the sun has come up behind me here to the east. We have the streets, as you can see, which are empty. Some of them in Lower Manhattan are sealed off, but the streets around us at 34th Street, traffic is being allowed, or some traffic at least. However, when you look over to the east of us, just 2 blocks away, there's an Empire State Building that's shrouded in darkness right now. But we're told that the streets around the Empire State Building have been sealed off, as has the headquarters of the United Nations on the East River, which was evacuated on Tuesday. The fact is that these are obviously 2 prime targets, 2 big high-rises, 2 of the biggest buildings in New York City. The fear is that there may be more terrorists out there somewhere, perhaps with a car bomb, and so security will continue to be totally tight during this day.
Sure, sure. So what are you hearing in terms of how people are going to deal with their day? Are people going to try to get into the city, try to go to work, try to go about their business?
No, I don't think they are. They've been told, first of all, stay away from town if you don't have essential, absolutely critical business here. The bridges are closed to vehicular traffic, except for the George Washington Bridge, which may have just one lane under very strict control. So are the tunnels. Airports, of course, are closed. Much of the rail traffic has been shut down. Schools, private, public, parochial schools will be closed. The stock exchanges will be closed. Times Square, Broadway will be closed. No traditional Wednesday matinee performances tomorrow. So life is going to be very, very slow, very, very difficult. And one added little indication of how life changes here and the concern over security, Carol, right below us down here at 33rd Street, about 15 stories below us here, is the Central Post Office of New York City. This is not only the Central Post Office in the city, it's zip code 10001. Some pride taken by people in this 10001 zip code area. Well, the mail will go through, but on top of that post office is inscribed the famous saying about how no sleet or rain or storm or snow or whatever it's going to be will delay the letter carrier in carrying out his appointed rounds. Well, they'll be out tomorrow, but not totally, because tomorrow there will be no pickups from the Postal Service mailbox on the streets of New York City. The reason, obviously, the concern that some terrorist might put a bomb in a package and try to mail it off. They'll be closed and sealed.
Tomorrow already being today, as we look at the scene now, and it looks like the sky is beginning to glow with possibility of the sun rising on this devastation. Garrick, also, I heard that some 3,000 National Guardsmen are going to be deployed throughout the city. Potentially, New Yorkers could be waking up to armed guards standing on their street corners.
Well, armed guards, the 3,000 mobilized by Governor Pataki have been moved in. They're there to supplement the police department, which is obviously stressed and overburdened. You can't maintain full force 24 hours a day. So, yes, we expect to see them there. There has been, this must be emphasized, no indication of security or increase in crime or looting or anything like this. For all the chaos we've seen today or yesterday and the human misery which continues today, the fact is that people have been amazingly orderly and disciplined in their behavior. And I think people in this city, in this metropolis, are taking a great deal of pride in that. So the National Guardsmen and women will be here, but there's no real security problem of that nature in the streets of New York today.
Yeah, and certainly we expect to see that typical New York can-do spirit. I don't know about you, but yesterday, as I was watching these pictures on the monitor, I was going through a mental Rolodex as to who I knew in New York, where they were working, did I know anybody in the World Trade Center? If people have those questions, what should they do? Yesterday, the telephone companies and the authorities were saying, please lay off the telephone lines. We need to keep those clear. What are the instructions for people if they're still trying to get information? What should they do?
Well, there are a number of lines that have been set up, 800 lines and other lines, not just by the government and officials here, but also by individual companies. There are scores of companies that have enormous businesses in the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers. Some of these financial companies had 10, 20, even 22 or 25 floors filled with employees. They have set up their own hotlines, their own emergency lines to allow families and friends to call them. And that's about the only way we're really going to know or get an early estimate as to how many casualties there have been in this tragedy. It'll take weeks to get the remains out, the bodies out. But if a census can be done, and the fact that de facto nose counting of who is still around, who can be reached, and who isn't, then perhaps by the end of today, we'll get a rough idea of how many missing there are among the civilians, non-city employees working in the Twin Towers, and the full scope and human cost of this tragedy in New York City will begin to be known.
Boy, we're just seeing some closer up pictures of the devastation down there by the World Trade Center. Firefighters going through some of that wreckage. It does look like a war zone, and I'm wondering, are people facing any sorts of shortages there, any food shortages, fuel shortages?
Well, I ran out earlier last night to get a quick sandwich, walked into a diner here on 34th Street and said, give me a cheeseburger. And he says, no hamburgers. I said, no hamburgers? He says, no hamburgers delivered today. All deliveries have stopped. I said, what do you have? And he had some soup and a salad, and that was it. But that's a minor incident. There are no signs of serious shortages. However, if the tunnels and bridges are kept close to general delivery by trucks of foods, then in a day or two, you could have shortages. However, I would imagine, nobody said this officially, that by the end of business of this day, I think city officials will want to get traffic moving again, commerce moving again, and supplies coming into Manhattan, which after all is an island with only a few bridges across the East River and a couple of tunnels and a bridge across the Hudson here. This is an island, and the drawbridges have been drawn up.
Yeah, and I'm sure, as Mayor Giuliani and Governor Pataki were saying yesterday, they want calm on the streets, but I think they also want a show of faith in their administration and a show of faith in the firefighters and the police officers who are responding, the National Guardsmen and women who are going to be responding and on the street corners. New Yorkers seem to have risen to the occasion. I haven't heard much about looting or crime going on.
No, we said that before. I just mentioned that the fact is that there is no reports of looting of any sort, and certainly the opportunities were there in Lower Manhattan. Businesses were being closed, the merchants were racing away to save themselves, owners of shops just as everybody else was today. But we've had no indication of that, and again, people take great pride in that. I think what people are going to be doing here, as those across the nation and around the world watching these scenes right now of these big earth-moving machines that are going to work down there in Lower Manhattan, is to really spend this Wednesday, as many as possible, at home. Yes, trying to find out what's happened to friends or relatives who might have been trapped in the trade towers, the two towers, and the third building which collapsed next door to it. And just pray and hope for the best. That's the spirit. That's not New York spirit alone. That's human spirit.
The human spirit, absolutely, under trying times. Thank you so much, Garrick Utley, reporting live from New York at our New York bureau. Vince?
The day after the attack will no doubt be a long one in Washington, where U.S. leaders are deciding what the next step will be. And joining us now live again is CNN senior White House correspondent John King. And John, what do we expect President Bush, will do today?
Well, Vince, let me start first by saying just in the past few minutes we have seen the lights come on in the White House residence behind me. On a normal day, the president generally rises between 5 and 5:20 a.m. every day to begin his day. This, of course, anything but a normal day, but some activity already at the White House. We are told by senior administration officials the president will, once he reports to work at the Oval Office, receive an update on the latest on the investigation, as well as the rescue and recovery efforts underway, as well as the diplomatic efforts by the State Department and others to reach out to key allies and other governments around the world for their assessment of this great tragedy. And then the president, very determined, much like we just heard from Garrick Utley in New York, very determined, even as the investigation, even as the rescue operations go underway, to show some sense of continuity, some sense of the government at work. The president will bring major congressional leaders down to the White House later this morning. They will deliver public remarks trying to reassure the American people that as the investigation continues and as the government promises to find out who did this and bring those parties to justice, that the business of the government will go on.
John, when we are threatened, and certainly we've never seen anything like this, but does the White House assemble, for lack of a better term, a usual suspects list? And are we moving any closer to clues as to who might be responsible for this?
Well, certainly the White House has a usual suspect list that begins because of the sophistication of these attacks. 4 planes hijacked at the same time. Obviously, some of the people aboard those planes being able to pilot them. The White House saying all signs point to, and we know from briefings given by senior administration officials to key members of Congress, they are saying that they believe that they are collecting credible evidence pointing to associates and affiliates of Osama bin Laden. They also caution us that they want to continue this investigation. And as that plays out, there are always fears. One of the reasons the president did not come directly back to Washington yesterday, there were fears of a follow-up round of attacks. At one point, they had not accounted for all of the planes in the skies over the United States. They did not want the president flying back until they had done so. Remarkable security all day yesterday here in Washington around the president. Air Force One had fighter jets flying in very close proximity to it. And overnight here in Washington, there has been a great debate in recent years about the decision a few years back to close Pennsylvania Avenue to car traffic, whether that was an intrusion on the public's rights to move about here in Washington, to see the sights of the Capitol. Overnight here in the Capitol, Vince, blocks away from the White House, police, Secret Service, even U.S. military Humvee vehicles setting up a perimeter much farther around the White House than we are used to seeing. You can be certain in the days and weeks ahead, security on high alert here in Washington. We're also told throughout the country, especially at airports and train stations and at U.S. embassies and military installations overseas as well.
Yeah, I don't think any question about that. As we look at this and we try to somehow make some semblance of sense of it all, Intelligence questions are arising, and Secretary of State Colin Powell said there were, quote, no specific warnings. As the White House and officials try to backtrack a little bit, are they doing that now, trying to see if maybe something was missed, something they could have acted on?
They certainly will do that, and they certainly are doing that. Their primary focus, especially in what they say and what they do in public right now, is on the relief and recovery effort and on the investigation. But make no mistake about it, we heard it throughout the day yesterday from administration officials, as well as especially from key members of Congress, people asking, how could this have happened? How could 4 commercial airliners be hijacked? How could there be no evidence at all that such an attack was being planned? A great number of questions about the efficiency of U.S. intelligence services, a great deal of criticism from key members of Congress yesterday, a great number of promises from key members of Congress to look ahead once we get past the dire days ahead of us as we deal, there you see the picture of the Pentagon, as we deal with repair and recovery, assessing the toll of the casualties and getting on with the investigation. A great number of promises from key members of the Congress to look once again, perhaps all raising the question, are the CIA and other agencies that do this human intelligence, are they underfunded? Are they doing things wrong? How might this have been prevented? Could it have been prevented?
Boy, the questions just continue. Senior correspondent John King, thank you very much for the update. Carol.
Vince, as John King has been reporting, and as we spoke to James Rubin earlier today, what President Bush is looking for is support internationally for the fight against terrorism. So we move overseas now to CNN Chief International Correspondent Christiane Amanpour, who's in London. Christiane, you've been looking at the morning newspapers. What is the read today over there?
Well, Carol, the sense of shock here across this side of the Atlantic is profound, and it seems to be growing, not diminishing, as this unfolding catastrophe becomes more and more clear. In England, for instance, the normally hyperventilating tabloids are saying things like, is this the end of the world? Or that you might expect from these kinds of tabloids, but the otherwise cerebral and normally cautious and careful broadsheets, the Financial Times has got a front page headline entirely devoted to this. They call it Assault on America. Another U.S. British paper calls it Doomsday in America. And here in France, on a leading newspaper, The Figaro, it is saying the new war. All radio and television programs here in the United Kingdom and around Europe that I've heard and that we've been tapping into are almost entirely devoted to this catastrophe. Leaders from all the European countries have spoken publicly about their unlimited support for the United States, not just moral support for the United States and the victims of this catastrophe, but also they pledge themselves publicly to what they say will have to be a renewed effort by all democracies, a worldwide effort, they say, to try to defeat and eradicate this kind of terrorism. In England, certain specific measures have been taken. All commercial airlines are banned from flying over central London. There is heightened security at key areas and key buildings, particularly around the airport. British Airways, the national carrier, has cancelled flights to Pakistan, which neighbors Afghanistan, also to Tel Aviv. You know, Israel has closed down its airspace to any foreign carriers. Air France, the French national carrier, has also banned its flights from going to Tel Aviv, obviously because that airport is closed, but also to North America, while that situation resolves itself in terms of airport closures there. But an intense state of alert and security. All the European governments, most of them, say that they're holding top-level national security meetings today. In Britain, the Prime Minister has convened his top ministers of defense, his Foreign Secretary and his Home Secretary, to an emergency meeting at the Prime Minister's residence. Jack Straw, the Foreign Secretary, earlier today said that it was perhaps too early to point the specific finger. They said that while they do share intelligence with the United States, he would not reveal that kind of intelligence, although he says that it should not be underestimated the magnitude of what happened in the United States yesterday.
This is an event of such horrifying, unimaginable proportions that I believe it's one where the shock grows over time rather than diminishes, as the reality of it impacts upon all of us, and we come better to understand the appalling consequences obviously for the victims, for their families, for the community in New York, for the people of the United States, and for the world's democratic communities.
Now, while leaders and commentators and analysts are generally saying that a state of war has been declared against the United States and against what they call civilized humanity, they're saying that it is important, Jack Straw saying, to keep a cool head while at the same time realizing and eventually responding to the profound nature of what happened against the targets of democracy and the United States yesterday. Now, in the Arab world, most of the Arab countries who are allied with the United States, most of the moderate Arab countries, the leadership has come out vigorously condemning the attacks yesterday. There is slightly different mood on the streets of the Arab world, where in some capitals and in some parts of the Arab world, people are saying that this was an inevitable eventuality. They say that this is something perhaps that the United States should have expected, given what they say is the U.S. Close association with the State of Israel. And as you know, this 11-month intifada has been ratcheting up anti-American feelings amongst the Arab peoples over the last 11 months. Having said that, Libya, which has not had a history of close relations with the United States, Libya came out condemning what it called this terrorist attack. And today there is word from the OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Conference. 57 Islamic nations have come out condemning this attack, saying that it is against Islam. Carol?
Christiane, as you probably know by now, we expect that U.S. domestic flights will begin flying again around midday, although there will be extreme and heightened security at all of the nation's airports. What is the situation in Europe? Are flights going to be resuming, trains resuming, and how tight is security across the board?
Well, security is exceptionally tight, as you can imagine. There were scenes of not chaos, but controlled disruption yesterday at all the airports, with obviously hundreds of passengers trying to get to the United States and people waiting for visitors coming from the United States. And European airlines and air companies are having to deal with many, many stranded passengers as they await news from the United States as to when those airports will be open for operations sometime in the not too distant future, they hope. I was flying back from an assignment in Africa yesterday aboard Air France, the French national carrier, and there was an intense security and heightened sense of caution on the flight. The captain, in a rather extraordinary measure, came into the main cabin, took the microphone and asked everybody to be alert, to look around them, to observe whether they noticed anything alarming, different, abnormal, to report anything that they saw that was potentially cause for concern. It was very chilling, it was very tense, it was very stressful. Having said that, Air France takes these kind of security precautions in various tense areas, for instance, the west coast of Africa, and they have private security agents on board who fly on their flights, and not only that, check passengers coming onto the flight. Even once they've been through all the airport security, at the bottom of the plane, at the foot of the steps, they're checked once again, both a body search and a baggage search.
Certainly.
Carol?
Yeah, not unheard of even in normal times. Thank you very much. Christiane Amanpour reporting live from London. Vince?
Well, you can add the date of September 11th, 2001 to those seared into the national consciousness. Pearl Harbor, John Kennedy's assassination, the Oklahoma City bombing, and now this one. 9th month, 11th day, 911, a national emergency. CNN's Ann McDermott tells us how some residents of Southern California reacted to this tragedy.
Everyone watched the TV. Some cried.
It's horrible. Yeah, it was very horrible.
Some raged.
I think we should retaliate and bomb the hell out of them.
And these Los Angeles firefighters watched with particular intensity because so many of their brothers and sisters in New York were dead. Maybe 100 firefighters die in a year across the nation. The figure in this one city, this one day, will be much, much higher.
Anything they need, we're there for them.
The pictures were just so insane that all these University of Southern California students could do was stare. But the younger ones had questions, lots of questions.
But when I first saw on the news, I sort of wondered how protected we really are in America.
Think they'll be able to catch all the people involved?
Their teacher, for once, had no answers.
How? Why? These are the questions.
And here's one more.
Do you think anything like this would ever happen again?
Will it happen again? Psychologists say that's what can make people so crazy at first.
It's not that we're afraid of the unknown. In the face of the unknown, we fill it in. We think there are monsters out there, and we actually end up frightening ourselves more.
Did the president's speech help?
I thought his point that, that they can knock the buildings down, but they cannot knock down our resolve. I thought that was a very good point he made.
Many of these people in an LA area gym admitted they were frightened and came here only for something to do.
I'm looking at the streets and it looks like Beirut, and I can't believe it's my backyard.
The smoke continues to billow out of the Trade Center building 6 hours.
I think we're definitely going to go to war.
This Korean War vet sure hopes not, but he knows the feeling.
I see what it says right there. America under attack. People didn't have to die.
But they did die, and America's in mourning. Ann McDermott, CNN, Los Angeles.